Good morning. Don't stop eating, don't stop getting food, but we have a very full program today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Drew Clark. I'm the chairman and publisher of BroadbandBreakfast.com. We're a news and event company, and we are very happy to be continuing our Broadband Breakfast Club tradition now for almost 2 years. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our keynote speaker, and after the keynote, our panel as well. Lynn Stanton is a senior editor at TR Daily, and she has been covering this issue for a very long time. She joined TR as a copy editor in '94 and has spent most of the past 16 years reporting on telecom regulatory policy. And she's also covered pharmaceutical marketing issues, as well as being a one-time Jeopardy contestant. So we're very happy that Lynn Stanton will be joining us. And I'm sorry, one more thing. Very much appreciate the support of our sponsors that makes this breakfast possible. Please join me in thanking the Telecommunications Industry Association, the Benton Foundation, International Broadband Electric Communications, Inc., and the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. So, Lynn, please.
Thank you, Drew. Our keynote speaker this morning is Pamela Miller, the Director General of the Telecommunications Policy Branch at Industry Canada, one of the governmental departments in Canada, where she develops and maintains framework policies, legislation, and regulations governing the telecom and radio communication sectors, considers appeals of the Canadian radio, television, and telecommunications decisions, and develops and represents Canadian telecom and spectrum policies internationally. Previously, she was Director of Strategy and Strategic Policy and Planning in the Spectrum Information Technologies and Telecommunications sector, and Directors of Service Strategy at the Treasury Board Secretariat. After the keynote speaker, then we will have the reaction from the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for coming out in the rain this morning. It's a little bit wet and damp out there, so it's great to see everyone out. And thank you to the Canadian Embassy for making the invitation possible, and to the Breakfast Club as well. I welcome the opportunity to share a Canadian perspective on the FCC's National Broadband Plan and on Canada's approach to telecommunications policy more generally. And I'm going to spend quite a lot of time in the presentation speaking about what we're doing in Canada, just because you're probably not as well aware of that. So I'm going to take the opportunity to update on that. So the next slide. I'm going to start first by introducing you to our department and share with you a little about what the Telecom Policy Branch does at Industry Canada. Industry Canada is a federal department charged with fostering the growth and competitiveness of the Canadian economy. It's a large portfolio. It goes from scientific research to tourism and small business development to telecom policy, just to name a few. We have the lead in terms of developing policy and legislation that promotes competitive, reliable, and innovative, affordable telecom services. We are responsible for the Telecom Act. We brief Cabinet on key policy and regulatory issues related to both wired and wireless, and represent the Government of Canada on international negotiations. So it's sort of a comprehensive ministry. Just briefly on the next slide, you'll just see that we have other aspects of the portfolio looking at competition and broadcasting. We have a separate agency that looks at the cultural and broadcasting issues. And we do have a regulator, the CRTC, that is in charge of the implementation on the regulatory front for telecom regulation. For spectrum, however, Industry Canada is both the policymaker and the regulator, so we combine both functions into one. So turning to slide 4, looking at the market structure in the industry, and I think that's where you really have to start when you talk about broadband. When we look at approaches of different countries, I think a lot of the policy measures are driven by the different industry structures, the different history, the different geography of the countries. Canada shares a similar market structure to the US and some of the same challenges. We have a large landmass, dispersed population, and relatively low population density in many regions. Our market is also characterized by regionalized, facility-based competition between incumbent telephone and cable companies, something that sets our country apart from other nations, just as in the US. You don't find that in Europe, you don't find that in Australia. So that's a theme we often go back to, that we do have facilities-based competition in Canada. Canadian cable companies have begun to deploy DOCSIS 3 technologies, which enable speeds of 50 and 100 megabits download. Telcos are also deploying fiber deeper into their networks to offer faster speeds and new services such as IPTV. Fiber to the premise developments have been fairly limited to condo and greenfield deployments in certain cities in eastern Canada, where aerial plant is more common. This is an area where Canada is sometimes criticized as being behind some other jurisdictions, but we are starting to see some of deployments to be rolled out, and in general, we're seeing upgrading of networks through the DOCSIS 3 and through driving fiber deeper into the network. With respect to wireless, we have 3 national players, which are now all GSM-based. Each offers services on high-speed packet access plus, HSPA, which deliver theoretical speeds of up to 21 megabits per second. We're also seeing some new entries in wireless following our last spectrum auction, the AWS auction. We had a set-aside to encourage new entry, and we had several new entrants, both regional and national. One new entrant has already launched, offering services in several major Canadian cities, and several should follow in 2010, 2011. Just looking more closely at the telecom sector on slide 5, very much like in the US, the cable codes have managed to make significant inroads into residential broadband. In fact, they have captured over half of the internet subscribers at the end of 2008. Part of these gains are due to the fact they can offer bundles of internet, voice, and video service. By going into the voice market, they've really provided vibrant competition for voice as well as internet. In the business market, incumbents maintain the edge. Cable codes have a relatively small presence in this segment since their facilities were originally built to offer residential television services. However, we are seeing more inroads by cable codes, and especially they're now looking at small business. One of the providers just started marketing even recently as last week, special services to small business. On the wireless side, national subscriber share is split among 3 players, Rogers, as well as TELUS and Bell. And together, these companies account for 95% of wireless subscribers at the end of 2009. So it's a fairly concentrated market for wireless services. Now turning to the FCC plan on page 6. Now that I've provided a bit of backgrounder on the Canadian market, I'd like to move into the FCC plan and share with you how Canada is tackling many of the same issues. But before I begin, I would like to congratulate the initiative headed by Blair Levine, who's with us today, and the entire FCC on the delivery of this very impressive and ambitious document. I think everyone who reads it, everyone who's looked at the scope and breadth and has seen the level of effort involved with the consultations and the research and analysis has to be impressed with this effort. It really is full of knowledge and interesting ideas for the rest of the world to take notice of. The plan is US focused, but there is a number of important insights for other countries, and there's a few areas I'd like to touch on. Universal service reform and broadband availability, access to spectrum and the plan to make 500 megahertz of new spectrum available, network infrastructure targets, consumer transparency and data collection, and review of wholesale competition regulations. So if we just stay on this next slide, this is our equivalent to what the FCC did in terms of consultation. We have just launched what we're calling a national digital economy strategy. This year's new session of Parliament stated, if we could just go back, we could stay on that one, I guess. This year's new session of Parliament stated that Canada will launch a digital economy strategy to drive the adoption of new technology across the economy. In fact, just last week, the Minister of Industry kicked off public consultations of a whole-of-government approach towards an action plan on the digital economy, seeking feedback from Canadians on what our goals and priority areas should be. At the conclusion of these consultations, which will run about 2 months, input will be carefully considered by the government, which will help inform the development of the strategy. Like the FCC, National Broadband Plan, it will be all-encompassing, including elements on innovation using digital technologies, digital infrastructure, promoting the Canadian ICT sector, promoting the creation of Canadian content, and digital skills and literacy development. So on the next slide, we see the 5 pillars, and in just a little snapshot of the challenges in each one. The industry department is responsible for the first of these 3 pillars, innovation using ICTs, digital infrastructure, and growing the ICT industry. I'd like to focus on digital infrastructure issues, or what we've been calling building a world-class infrastructure. This entails ensuring that legislative frameworks are in place to promote competition and investment, providing timely and predictable access to spectrum, and ensuring that Canadians living and conducting business in rural and remote regions of the country have access to high-quality broadband services. So on the next slide, what has been the approach to the Government of Canada to these issues? To date on broadband, we have been following pretty much a market-driven approach, and where there has been market failure, we have stepped in with targeted government funding. In 2006, the government issued a policy direction to the CRTC indicating that it should rely on market forces to the maximum extent feasible in the implementation of the objectives of the Telecom Act. Regulation, where required, should be minimally intrusive, transparent, efficient, and effective. It also required the CRTC to conduct a holistic review of its wholesale access regime with a view to increasing incentives for innovation and investment. With regards to spectrum, a new spectrum policy management framework was devised in 2007. The core objective of the framework is to maximize the social and economic benefit Canadians derive from the use of this scarce resource. Again, the framework emphasized reliance on market forces to the maximum extent feasible, and that regulation, where necessary, should be minimally intrusive. So on page 10, the FCC's proposed universal service reform has garnered significant attention. So I'd like to discuss for a moment Canada's universal service regime. First, I'd like to mention that our regime has been significantly streamlined from $3.2 billion in 1993 to $208 million in 2009. This fund now accounts for roughly 1% of eligible telecom revenues. It was as high as 4.5% in eligible revenues in 2001. So it has been significantly streamlined. It's very focused and limited to subsidizing voice services in high-cost areas only. There are no affordability programs such as E-Rate, Lifeline, or LinkUp. Funding to broadband for households, schools, and libraries in rural and remote areas has been supported through direct funding from general revenues rather than from cross-subsidies. Combined with private sector-led investment, these programs have brought broadband internet services to 94% of Canadian households by the end of 2008, which we define as 1.5 megabits per second. The current $225 million Broadband Canada Connecting Rural Canadians program is expected to increase broadband coverage to additional households in rural and remote areas. Recently, it was announced 52 projects had received conditional funding of $77 million, bringing broadband to an estimated 170,000 households. Several provinces also have their own broadband initiatives. At this time, the CRTC, the regulator, is also reviewing the universal service this year, looking at markets which requires an obligation to serve, which markets require an obligation to serve, whether wireless could fulfill the obligation, and whether to include high-speed internet access as part of it. So this is an important proceeding where the regulator is now re-looking at the concept of universal service and whether it should be changed from a voice to a broadband requirement. As I mentioned, our fund is quite small because it's been streamlined, so there's not a lot of flexibility in that fund right now. It's very focused on voice, and it's very, very small. Looking at spectrum on slide 11, as far as the demand for spectrum is concerned, it is clear that new applications and technologies will continue to the explosive growth of mobile broadband, and we really noted with interest the work that's been done by CTIA and also the analysis in the broadband plan. The FCC is proposed to move forward with a number of spectrum reforms to accommodate this demand, including a recommendation to allocate an additional 500 megahertz of spectrum over the next 10 years, 120 megahertz of which will come from broadcasters, I'm sure, as you're well aware. We're really watching this with interest, and the idea of the incentive auctions is something that I think is an intriguing idea, and as I said, we're watching the developments with interest. We've traditionally used what we call a fast follow approach vis-a-vis the US due to economies of scale and being a very close neighbor. We want to be in alignment with a lot of the US approaches. So as I said, we'll be watching with interest. Our regulator has set a DTV transition deadline of August 31st, 2011. We plan to auction the 25 megahertz and 700 megahertz spectrum in the timeframes of approximately 2012-13. Nothing's firmly set up yet, but that's the deadlines that we're looking at. We're also looking at options to inventory the use of spectrum to evaluate when spectrum could be used more intensively or reallocated, and possibly looking at some of the current regulatory impediments. So when we pass on to the issue of infrastructure targets, which is always a controversial issue, the FCC plan, similar to the digital action plans of many other nations such as the UK and Australia, set explicit network infrastructure targets. These targets providing cutting-edge speeds of 100 megabits to 100 million households, ensuring all have access to speeds of 4 megabits, and providing schools, hospitals, and libraries with 1 gigabit are ambitious and visionary targets. In Canada, we have not established targets, although federally funded broadband initiatives must meet our definition of broadband, which is a minimum download of 1.5 megabits. To date, our approach has been to rely on private sector-led investment in combination with focused and targeted initiatives to underserved areas. Our digital economy consultations will provide useful information on the needs of various users, as well as feedback from suppliers of telecom services. This will help us to assess whether targets are appropriate, what they should be, and what the time horizon should be for achieving them. Now, passing on to the issue of data transparency, consumer transparency, and data collection. The FCC plan highlights that more and better data is needed to enable the development of data-driven broadband policy. In Canada, we have also recognized this as a priority. Good data is critical to accurately measuring the current state of affairs and measuring ongoing progress in meeting our objectives. Certain information gaps persist, particularly with respect to the deployment of advanced network services. This is why we have asked the regulator to conduct a study on business broadband pricing and availability in several representative Canadian cities. The regulator will also be publishing more granular data on higher speed residential broadband services in the 2010 edition of its monitoring report. We're going to be very interested to see the results of this because it'll give us a very good picture of what is actually available in the network, what speeds can Canadians actually receive throughout the country. More and better data allows consumers to make more informed decisions with respect to the telecom services they purchase. With respect to transparency, the regulator requires that internet service providers disclose the purpose and effect of any traffic management practices that they may be using. This was made in a ruling last fall. So I'll spend a bit more time on this because I know that that issue of internet traffic management is a very subject of interest. So last fall, our regulator issued a regulatory policy on internet traffic management practices. It highlights a number of important aspects. ISPs must disclose the internet traffic management practices that they use in plain language. Network investment and economic measures are preferable to technical measures. Technical measures such as slowing down certain types of traffic are acceptable as long as they are narrowly tailored, result in minimal discrimination and harm to users, and are more effective than other approaches. Blocking of traffic is prohibited, as is the notable degradation of real-time traffic such as VoIP, unless prior approval is received. If consumers have complaints about practices of their ISPs, they can file complaints with the CRTC, the regulator, which will be assessed on an ex post basis against the framework. This policy was very well received by the stakeholders, and the regulator has followed up with certain ISPs to ensure that their traffic management practices are transparent and adequately disclosed on their websites. Now passing to wholesale regulation. On the next slide. The National Broadband Plan calls for a comprehensive review of wholesale competition regulations to develop a coherent and effective framework. With respect to wholesale competition, our regulator conducted a holistic review in 2008, developing a new framework. The review was guided by the 2006 policy direction to rely on market forces to the maximum extent feasible. The intent of the review was to rationalize the existing framework, which had grown in an ad hoc fashion as a result of a number of case-by-case determinations. The new framework revised the definition of an essential service and deemed that nearly 1/3 of services were deemed non-essential and subject to phase out over a 3 to 5 year period. This year, the CRTC will be holding a proceeding on related issues, essentially looking at how the framework should apply on a forward basis. A key question is whether mandated competitor access to so-called next-generation network infrastructure owned by the incumbents should be reduced or extended. So turning to the next slide, there is one final item that's being debated and discussed in Canada, which I would mention: the review of foreign investment restrictions in the satellite and telecom industries. This review was announced in the new session of Parliament and the 2010 budget, stating that foreign investment is an important way of strengthening market competition and attracting new capital and innovative ideas from abroad. Satellite legislation is a fairly contained issue. Legislation has already been tabled to amend the Telecom Act in this regard. Liberalization to the broader telecom sector is much more complex. We're currently developing options for next steps onto how to move forward on this and how to consult. So to wrap up, it is clear that our nations face some of the same challenges as we try to move forward on these issues. More and more each day, each sector of our economy and society is relying on these technologies. As we know, they're core to both consumers and business. And I think what the FCC, the plan that was put forward and the National Broadband Plan truly has a very holistic, comprehensive, integrated approach to the issue, which I think is certainly a combined package of great interest to other countries. And we really look forward to seeing how the implementation stage goes. I know there's a lot of big issues ahead of you. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Sure. So I'd like to invite the rest of our panel to come up and join us. Reinhardt, Blair, Young, everybody, okay. And while they're doing that, Pamela, could I ask you about the universal service regime and how exactly it is that you took it down, such a significant amount from over $3 billion to $208 million? Is that by limiting the number of lines and areas that are eligible, or is it from productivity gains, or how exactly was that accomplished?
I think the changes were basically by providing the focus on the voice aspect.
Oh, so it used to be, do more
Well-
things
well,
like E-rate and...
just through efficiency gains as well, and just tightening up the whole program administration.
Okay, thank you very much. While our panel is gathering, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction on them. There's lengthier bios in the handouts that you should have received. Our panel includes Young K. No, who's Minister Counselor from the Korean Embassy, who has worked in the Ministry of Information and Communications, now known as the Korea Communication Commission, for 25 years. While there, he was worked on drafting Korea's telecom competition policy framework and its master plan for informatization, broadband deployment, adoption, and usage. We also have Robin Twyman, First Secretary for Trade and Business Affairs at the British Embassy, responsible for information and communications technology and intellectual property issues, who came to the that Washington posting in July 2009 with more than 30 years of diplomatic career experience, including a stint as UK delegate to the World Trade Organization. And we have Reinhard Wieck, Managing Director of the Washington office of Deutsche Telekom, who represents DT before U.S. authorities and other relevant entities. Before joining DT in 1992, he was an associate fellow at the Departments of Law and Economics at the University of Pennsylvania and a senior economist at the Max Planck Institute for International and Foreign Private Law in Hamburg. And the final member of our panel this morning is Blair Levin, who is Executive Director of the FCC's Omnibus Initiative during the past year, oversaw the development of the U.S. National Broadband Plan. After completing that task, he left the FCC. Is that better? He left the FCC earlier this month and is currently a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute's Communications and Society program. Overseeing the broadband plan was his second stint at the FCC. In the 1990s, he was chief of staff to FCC Chairman Reed Hundt, overseeing such minor FCC efforts as implementing the 1996 Telecom Act. Between his two stints at the commission, he was an analyst at Legg Mason and Stifel Nicholas. We're going to let him speak after the other panelists so that he can kind of respond to their view of the broadband plan. I guess we'll just go down the line here. Did you want to start, Robin?
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about international perspectives on the FCC's National Broadband Plan. And countries like the UK, with its Digital Britain, have been taking on similar commitments and making similar strategies with sort of comparable areas that we're looking at, modernized wired and wireless infrastructure, promoting investment and innovation, universal service commitments, public service, online safety, and developing digital skills. In the UK, compared to the situation when I was growing up in the UK in the 1970s with sort of one single fixed landline supply and 3 TV channels, we've now got over 100 ISP providers providing a range of services from health, online shopping, communications, banking, job search, publishing, and live and on-demand broadcasting. Those 100 ISP providers are providing broadband access of at least 2 megabits per second to 89% of the population. The Digital Britain includes a universal service commitment of speeds of 2 megabits per second by 2012. And looking ahead, it's got ambitions of the next generation of superfast broadband speeds. Next generation superfast broadband, 90% coverage by 2017. And companies are already rolling that out. Companies like Virgin hope to get speeds of 50 megabits per second to 50% of UK homes by this summer. British Telecom have got similar ambitions too. The European Commission today is going to be announcing its own digital agenda with comparable speeds, but I'm not going to get ahead of them. This is particularly important to the UK because of the impact it has on our economy as well as our society. The digital economy is worth 8% to the UK's GDP. The first generation broadband delivered GDP increases to the UK economy of between 0.5 and 1%. The digital economy is the platform to so many of our business sectors. financial services, retail, commerce, energy, transport, and that's before we get into the public service areas, government, e-health, and things like that. The latest stage we've done in the UK was the Digital Economy Act that received royal assent in April this year, and that puts in place some of the legislation to implement some of the recommendations from Digital Britain. There are 4 particular areas, which is, excuse me, improving infrastructure and spectrum licensing or spectrum auctioning, improving public services, particularly broadcasting and news, digital safety, and also helping the creative industries guard themselves against online copyright infringement. One of the things that I want to finish on is it's all very well having fast broadband, it's all very well having a rollout across the country, but if people aren't using it, then it sort of undermines the process. And that's why a key part, both of Digital Britain and I believe also the National Broadband Plan, is how to increase digital participation. In the UK, we have 65% of UK adults are online, but that does mean that 15 million adults are not online, are not taking advantage of the public and private sector online services. And the Digital Britain Plan includes a national plan for digital participation. It's a joint private sector and public sector initiative to help combat that. This Friday, there's in the UK, 1,500 locations across the UK, we're launching Silver Surfers Day, in which we hope to provide a gentle introduction to the internet and the computers for those aged 55 and over. There are also other initiatives going on looking at how we can increase the participation amongst disadvantaged. There's a scheme in Milton Keynes where they are renting out recycled council computers for about $2.25 a week, and also ways of trying to increase participation amongst the disabled. Sadly, when one looks at those with visual, hearing or mobility impairments, their uptake of the broadband is sort of about 20% below the national average. So we need to see what those barriers are, why those barriers are there, and how we can improve that. I won't delve into any of this much further because I want to give the rest of the panel a chance to speak too. Thank you very much for listening, and I would like to finish on an advertiser's warning, if you like. The Digital Britain and Digital Economy Act were part of the previous government. When I was invited to be on this panel, we had that previous government. The new government, the Conservative Liberal Democrat Party, will be reviewing those themes, the timings. There may be a change of emphasis and timings, but it's too early to say what that is. But I can't imagine that they will think that digital economy is any less important than the previous one. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Robin. Young?
Thank you so much for inviting me this morning. I am honored to speak before distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm working in Korean embassy now, and in Korea, we made our master plan in 1996. It's the first time, and usually we set 5-year plans, and we made 5 times for the national broadband plan in Korea. And now, currently, we have 12 million households are subscribing to broadband with 50 megabps or over. 12 million is 70% of a total household. And 16.4 million homes, it is 96% are subscribing to high-speed internet, ranging from 2 megabps to 50 megabps. And when it comes to the national coverage, the deployment, high-speed internet with 2 megabps or over penetrates 99% of the entire country. And broadband with 50 megabps or over penetrates about 80%. And I would like to say a short remark about the FCC's National Broadband Plan. As our keynote speaker said many times, FCC's National Broadband Plan is one of the most outstanding and well-organized broadband plan that I have ever known so far. It is not good to say as the Blaise here, but really it's an excellent plan. You did quite good job. And it seems that this plan was created after a thorough benchmarking and studying of all the broadband plans of the advanced countries. And I hope the policy goals presented in this plan surely be accomplished without any delay. And I think these goals can be achieved with and through the active participation and collaboration of all the related stakeholders. When viewing from Korean experience, it is critically important to ensure the cooperation of the related executive branches and the state government and local government for the timely and effective implementation. As you know, FCC cannot do and should not do everything alone. Actually, in Korea, we established the annual implementation plan of every related ministries for the successful and cooperative implementation of our master plan. And also, as you might know well, FCC needs to make sure, with the help of the Congress, to secure all the investment resources without any problem. And I'm sure that this plan is greatly valuable and effective for connecting all the corners of America, but also greatly helpful for the entire world, especially for the developing countries which desperately want to deploy and upgrade for the better competitiveness of the global economy. I expect this plan can be used, as our keynote speaker said, can be used as the practical guidelines for those countries facing so many barriers in deploying and upgrading their own networks. And it will be a blessing to see this plan help and contribute remarkably in expanding global broadband networks. In this respect, I would like to emphasize again that this plan must be implemented and succeed for the United States and for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Reinhard?
Yes, thank you. I thank you organizers for inviting Deutsche Telekom to speak here. As a personal remark, since I'm only for 2 months in town and some still feel like the rookie in town, it might be interesting for you since on the actual day-to-day, there is a digital agenda plan by President Barroso of the European Commission. And we have so many plans. And so it's interesting, well, to compare the substance and the direction of the plans. Because Europe and, of course, Germany is very well aware of the National Broadband Plan in the US, since the United States have always worked some kind as a blueprint for policy in other regions of the world, in particular for Brussels, in particular for Germany. So it could be interesting to have my fresh well, knowledge from Brussels and Germany, as well as comparing what the key features of the National Broadband Plan. So they are based on the same assessment of the importance of ICT on the growth, innovation, investment, employment. Hundreds of studies which all go in one direction. So it's important. 6% of the European economy is ICT, but it's 40% of the productivity gains by ICT, so it is important. What is same with respect to many of the broadband plans, as far as I can assess it, is the goals are very ambitious. The European goals say up to 2020 that every household in Europe should be connected to the internet, to broadband interconnect with at least 30 megabits, and 50% should have more than 100 megabits. If you say more than 100 megabits, you mean fiber to the home in the different modes, not VDSL type of service. Secondly, they're all the same on the question of spectrum issues and the efficient use of spectrum. So we are very happy that the FCC put the spectrum issue very much on top of the agenda. I think it has the possibility to fulfill the need for more radio spectrum for customers' needs and broadband services. And as my chairman put it at the CTIA in Las Vegas 1.5 months ago, the US market is stronger now than Europe with respect to every measure you have on mobile data. So it's a very interesting market, and of course it will attract investment in these markets. Thirdly, all the broadband plans will enhance digital literacy and skills. Fourth, they all address, competition within the market and competitiveness between the markets. So it's interesting when they're all speeded up what the effect on competition will be. There are fifth rising concerns in cybercrime and low trust. That's a very fundamental issue in Europe as well. You are all certain that data protection has always been a huge issue in Europe. And seventh, and that's one major cornerstone of the digital agenda, again, a flagship project of President Barroso, ICT-enabled benefits in other industries. So if ICT accounts for 6% of the total value of the economy and has 40% of productivity, it has to go somewhere. So it will go into smart metering issues, smart grids, e-health, e-learning, transportation, and so forth. But there are not only similarities, there are a few differences as compared between Europe and the United States. First, Europe relies heavily on access regulation, on kind of, if I may say so, fine-tuned access regulation. And that's quite different from the more light-hand regulation style, at least in particular if you compare it to the broadband regulation in the United States. And we see, of course, from many studies, a link between those two issues, having hard-handed ex-ante regulation and investment in innovation. And as the digital agenda, I only have a draft of this. It says April, it says still April, but the draft says it's not European incumbents. They're also the same. You're quite aware of this, but it's the official Commission's report which states there is a lack of investment in new generation networks in Europe. So there has something to be done then. There's also a lack of investment in R&D. That's what the report states. What you might not be as familiar with it, that when you talk about the European Commission, it is still 27 member states. It's not states. If you look, for instance, at Germany, it's had 16 states again, and you have different legislations in all states and in some of the member states. So you have fragmented markets in Europe. For instance, with concern to content markets, you have 27 content markets, and in Germany, again, 16 different legislation in all the states like Bavaria and others. You have no single market for electronic payments. And finally, there's a lack of interoperability and standard setting, and these are clearly things were much in favor for the US markets and the US economies. So there are things to catch up in Europe with and between the member states, but in a nutshell, they all go into the same direction with broadband plans, and they all look at each other, how they behave, and what kind of concrete measures they have. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Claire.
Well, thank you very much. Now that I'm no longer at the FCC, I feel I don't have a conflict in saying that I joined with my colleagues on the panel in completely praising the FCC's National Broadband Plan. Truly, as I said, impressive, outstanding. No, seriously, actually, if you were sitting where I was sitting on, say, August 1st of last year, and you were looking at the mountain that needed to be climbed, it actually, I think all of us who had the great honor of working on it are very, very pleased with what it came out. And I quite sincerely thank my colleagues here for their comments. I'll just make a couple of quick comments. First of all, I'll reveal for the first time that the secret inspiration for a lot of the plan was an ad. Apple's run some of the best ads ever. One of the ones that did not kind of get the Hall of Fame, but I always thought was a really great one was, I think it was the late 80s. A bunch of people are in an office, and they're looking at computers, and one guy says, which computer do you think is the most powerful? And a guy says, oh, it's the one that has so many gigs and so many this and so many that with a bunch of numbers. And then the other guy said, I think it's the one that people use. And they looked over, and there were a bunch of people standing around an Apple computer, and this was, back in the classic Apple versus Windows days. But our view of broadband is the important thing is not the numbers, it's how people use it. So the entire second half of the plan, focusing particularly on the public sector uses, that's really what drove it. And I think that wasn't true earlier on in some of the early versions of national plans, but I think that's becoming clearer to people, and we certainly benefited from the wisdom of some later plans. The important thing is how people use it. And in that regard, I think another kind of differentiation, particularly from the early generations of plans, was the focus on spectrum. It's pretty clear that maybe not to the extent that voice is becoming a mobile phenomenon, but data is really the next 10 years. It's going to be the fastest growing part of the economy in a lot of ways, and as a platform for growth, the kind of applications and the way people use it. Well, it's just, no one can predict it really well, but it's obviously going to be very big, and that's why the emphasis on spectrum is so important. And I do think that it's really, there are a couple of key ideas that I don't, and maybe this was our fault for not articulating them well, but just haven't been realized. And one of them was the importance of a process of constant reallocation of spectrum because of the way the market moves, and that you really need to have market mechanisms, including the ability to pay existing users to move, particularly when technology enables more effective uses of prior uses. And then the third thing I would just say is another thing that was a little bit of a surprise to me, and I don't think we covered it as much as I would have liked, but this, as we say, the plan is in beta and always will be, and we've really seen this a lot in the last week with Google in Europe, with Facebook here. Personal data is probably the single most underutilized asset on the internet. And in terms of creating the most compelling value proposition for use, while price is important, it's really the way people use it. And one can envision the use of broadband for all kinds of things related to health and education, et cetera, that if people feel comfortable with their personal data being there, it will do a huge amount to drive up adoption, drive up use, drive up new investment, new jobs, new applications. The problem is if people don't have a sense of confidence in the security of their data, they won't use it. And as much as we all like to sit up here and say, boy, it's the future with broadband is bright, the truth is we could hit a kind of personal data 9/11 moment or Katrina moment where there's a catastrophe and then people stop using it. And so that's a very tricky problem. I don't think we've figured out an answer. I actually think it's an international problem. And one of the things that I think for the international agenda, who's responsible for information located in the cloud when the cloud can be anywhere. So let me just close by saying that in the same way that as we looked at the applications in education, healthcare, public safety, and we found that local jurisdictions and local certifications, local licensing provided a barrier to where we really want to go. In the same way, we have to understand the internet does not respect boundaries, does not respect geographic boundaries, and all of the countries have to work together to make sure that, particularly in the area of personal data, that we have a regime that gives people that kind of sense of confidence that enables them to feel that putting their data there to take advantage of what this incredible vehicle can do is not going to endanger themselves or their families. So I think that's an agenda for all of us going forward. But thank you all very much for your comments.
Thank you. Before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to, even though I didn't hear any violent disagreement amongst you all, I'll give you all the opportunity if there was anything that another panelist said that you feel compelled to respond to. Anyone? Okay, I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask at least one question before I turn to the audience if you all want to be thinking about your questions. What should be the standard for judging the success of the U.S. National Broadband Plan or any country's national broadband plan or digital plan, digital economy plan? Anyone?
I'll kick off, if I may.
Okay.
I guess it's essentially going to boil down to what the objectives are as set out in that plan. And I spoke of digital Britain being important to the economy and society, but it did include some indicators, particularly the level of universal service we wanted to achieve, digital participation, delivery of public services, and sort of spectrum licensing. So I guess your top level is going to be how much is it helping your economy? How much is it helping efficient services? But your indicators are the sort of bits below that.
I would agree with that. I think it's in terms of economic and social benefits, it's what you do with the technology, what kind of results can you achieve using the technology that will be the hallmarks of success.
About the standard for the evaluation of success. First of all, infrastructure deployment, as the plan said, making internet with 100 square. That were are one of the standard for evaluation, but also broadband coverage for rural areas should be another important criteria because there are many low-income people or disabled or elderly people. This is another important focus and value for the plan. And however, as Pamela said, one of the most important criteria should be the utilization. That is how broadband system encourages all Americans to get many benefits through the broadband infrastructure.
Well, measurement of success is always a tricky thing. If policymakers would ask me in Brussels, I would say, well, combine different measures. Combine different measures and look at them. Do it measurable, observable, and so you have the standard output measures because at the end of the day, it's a question, well, is this service being used or is it not used? And so you have households, typical measures like households connected and so forth. Don't forget, because what Pamela said, there's underinvestment in Canada. Europe says there's lack of investment, and due to OECD measures, there's high investment in the United States and infrastructure. So you can combine it with an input measure, an investment, and that's easily to observe. I think time that's some kind of qualitative measure, but time seems to be very important. Again, coming to Canada, 2 more years for freeing up spectrum, and all mobile companies are willing to invest in 4G now. And what I have not said, just put it in here, there's an actual spectrum auction in Germany going on right now. It's a 200, let me check, it's a 207th round now. It's going since 4 weeks. There's a fierce battle, 4 major telecommunications mobile operators, including Vodafone, Telefonica, KPN, and Deutsche Telekom. And it's 360 megahertz being auctioned off It's a very tricky auction. It's going to be expensive. And it will, of course, bring new radio spectrum, needed radio spectrum to the market. So it's time would be the third point. And if you look at academics, there are many measures on the market which combine different strands of it, like the E-Connectivity Index done by Professor Waberman and other institutes. So that's a lot what you can do. You have to decide to make it observable. Thank you.
I think that question raises two sub-questions. One is about time, the other is about metrics. As to time, it reminds me there's this story, I think it's true. Henry Kissinger was meeting with the North Vietnamese foreign minister in the 70s. Kissinger asked the minister what he thought of the French Revolution, and the minister said, "Too soon to tell." I think you have to have a certain kind of perspective on time, which, and our, frankly, our perspective was the values of these things are not in the 1 to 2 year time frame. It will be the second half of this decade when we'll see really the benefit of what we did. Second thing is, as to the metrics, one of the really interesting things about this was it was very difficult to find a metric we thought was meaningful. I'll tell you outright that I don't think a metric, even though we use metrics, because you have to have a compass, you have to point in a direction. I don't know that the metric of 100 megs is the right metric, or well, I don't know why it's 100 as opposed to 120 or 103 or 97, right? I mean, it's kind of it really is about how people use it. There was a fascinating paper written by a Stanford economics professor in 1990 about computers in the economy, and but talking a lot about electricity. And he talked about how there was at the turn of the last century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, as people were starting to adopt electricity, there was a measurement bias in terms of all kind of the economists didn't really know how to measure the benefit of electricity, and I think we're kind of in the same stage with broadband. We really don't know how to measure its value, and I don't really have any wisdom about that at all. But let me just close by saying that one of the benefits of coming back to the FCC is one understands the way in which the important thing is really get on the right side of history. And you can't always know to a certain kind of level of detail or granularity what that means, but there are certain kind of paths and patterns that you want to be doing. For example, my first time, we spent a huge amount of time both in the legislative process and then after talking about Section 271. Does anyone remember what I know Diane does, but anyone else in this room remember what Section 271 was? Okay. How important was Section 271 now? Okay. On the other hand, when Reed and I got to the FCC in 1993, the plan for the digital television transition was a 30-year soft transition, which meant that the spectrum in the 700 megahertz would not be available until at the earliest 2023, and probably much longer. We said that's nuts. We wanted to have a 10-year, eventually became a 12-year. If we had not done that, America would not have spectrum for 4G. I know that sounds crazy, but I don't really see that. I mean, I don't know where people think it would have come from. That the spectrum of the Clearwire would exist, but the spectrum that AT&T and Verizon and others are going to be using for fourth generation wireless, which will be a huge economic boom to this country, would not have existed. Now, we did not know at the time that that's what it would be used for, but we thought we needed to be on the right side of the history. Mobile was really, really important. Spectrum was really, really important. It's just an input, right? I mean, you could, with more towers and more this and more that, it would just be a lot more expensive and the service would be lousier. But my point is, it's important to get on the right side of history in spectrum. It's important to get on the right side of history with set-top boxes. It's important not to have a universal service system do what it does today, which is to provide disincentives and kind of odd incentives to create all kinds of false businesses and things. So the point is, try to see where the patterns are, try to see what the inevitable things are, and move toward them faster, accelerate the movement to e-textbooks and things like that. That's really where I think, that's how I think it ought to be measured.
I'd like to take questions from the audience. If you can raise your hand, I can bring you a mic. I'll start back here. And if you could identify yourself, too.
Good morning. I'm Lucy Getman, National School Boards Association, and I was very interested in the keynotes regime, and I wonder if any of the other panelists would like to speak to affordability options, particularly for schools and libraries, and how their broadband initiatives are inclusive of education in order to make people well-educated, employable, competitive, et cetera, in a 21st century economy.
You have stumped the panel.
Well, I don't want to bore you again with Europe is different, but we don't use universal service funds. There actually is a provision in the European telecommunications law that universal service funds may be used, but in most member states they're not used. They're used for, there are two reasons. One reason is they have mandatory obligations to bring a number of services for firms treated as being dominant or having market power, for instance, like Deutsche Telekom in the German market. And they say, well, we don't interfere with market powers. We have the idea that the market will take care of these issues. And if I may add this on behalf of my company, Deutsche Telekom has, just two examples. Deutsche Telekom has wired all German schools with computers and lines, and Deutsche Telekom has founded a foundation, Deutsche Telekom Foundation, which is bringing more physics and more math to kids, to schools, and so forth. So it's a very well-known project to bring more from the ability side and skill side to this market. So in a nutshell, the European approach is don't overdo it with our interference into the market forces. The markets behave very well in Europe. If you see an example, if you say mobile phones, you could have said, well, why don't we make mobile phone a universal service? Everyone should have one. Now the average is 102% in Europe. Everyone has not only one, but 1.1 data cards. So universal service was not necessary to have a cell phone. Of course, there is regulation. Europe is different. Regulation on mobile rates in Europe. Thank you.
In Korea, we do not support school and library as a universal service fund. Actually, we do not have the universal service fund system. Instead, a government budget supports the school and library for the broadband. And actually, in the initial stage, the government paid all. Later, the schools and library made a deal with service providers, and they subscribe around half a price for the normal price. So in Korean case, for your reference.
Thanks. Just chip in from the UK side. We've got a slightly different emphasis on the public service part of the sort of broadband plan, where our emphasis is on providing accessible and affordable broadband access to all, and that's the chief concentration. When we look at sort of schools or access to computers, those who don't have them, at disadvantage, for example, we're providing that through libraries or through other government online centres. There are about 6,000 through the UK. Perhaps the closest part to, I guess, public service education I can come is the emphasis within Digital Britain, and this was reinforced in the Digital Economy Act, of the changes in broadcasting and changes on the obligations on the BBC, where if you look at the BBC's website, just go off on tangent for a second, which is the 6th most popular or viewed website in the UK, BBC is now expected to focus more on providing online hard documentary programs for older children. They figured that's where the gap in the sort of service was, and that's where they would focus it. So it's a different emphasis than was contained in the National Broadband Plan. Thank you.
Just very quickly, I'm very proud of what we did in the 90s with the E-rate, and one could say that that was the one thing in which the United States clearly led the world. We connected all the classrooms before anybody else, or kind of in excess of 95%. But it turns out that, well, I'd like to say I think it was great, it's not enough. And one of the things that part of the learning in the National Broadband Plan is it's really about the ecosystem. You not only have to have the networks, you have to have the devices, you have to have, and very importantly, the applications, which includes the training for teachers and things like that. So I think it's important when you think about the classrooms to have a holistic approach. And so other things have to be paid for, and where the funding comes from, interesting question. But the point is, it's not enough simply to connect, though that's also an essential part. A second thing is that there is a big difference between institutional needs and mass market needs. And we tried to talk about that a bit in a couple of different ways. One of which is the goal for the anchor institutions is a gig. And really, it's not quite clear to me what the use case is for individuals and homes that justifies 100. Could be there, and I know there are people in this room who think it actually is there, and that's great. I'm just saying it's not apparent in the market. Even in Korea, where people have access to those kinds of speeds, when you look at the actual use case of consumers, it's not quite clear. It is very clear that from an institutional perspective, schools, hospitals, governmental businesses, we're going to need high speed. So we need both kind of a fixed and mobile infrastructure to be successful. One is not enough. And secondly, we need appropriate sizing for both institutional and mass market, and schools certainly fit into that.
Thank you. Anybody else out here? I think I saw your hand first. Right.
Jerry Udwin with the Udwin Group. A two-part question, if you would. Maybe the first part for Reinhard, who mentioned that there is a connection, it seems, in Europe between the heavier regulation there for access and lower investment, and whether it seems that that's a connection that's going to be changed in any way. Is there going to become less or more regulation in Europe on the internet? And then what the other representatives on the panel have found the relationship is or expected to be in their countries.
And if anybody wants to weigh in on what they think might happen with the reclassification of broadband services here in terms of affecting that as well, feel free.
Thank you, Jerry, for your question. I will do it quick. Yes, there is, as I mentioned earlier, there is a relationship done by dozens of empirical studies that regulation hinders investment. The European Commission and the European lawmaker could not go into the direction of what the US did in 2003 and 2005. They could even not accept regulatory holidays. That's what is the case, regulatory holidays for so-called new markets, because they said it's contradictory to the European law that has been decided against the case of Germany. But there are as every European policymaker knows that something has to be done. And hard ex-ante regulation will not satisfy the needs for investments. And just to give you some numbers, there's an investment gap in Europe which is being calculated by 300 billion euro in infrastructure, in network infrastructure in Europe. So that's quite an amount. So what the European lawmaker, with a new review of the European regulation directives, have done is they have, some kind of invented a new form of incentive-setting regulation. It's still ex-ante regulation, but it's so-called risk-sharing schemes. You combine the interests of those who are willing to invest and have the failure and the risk with that investment. You combine it with those who say, well, we'd like to participate. We will not full blown, but we give you advance payment in wholesale products and so forth. So what is being thought of as a more cooperative viewpoint without, of course, harming competition. Thank you.
On that point, as the other panelists mentioned, there is a lot of empirical evidence about the impact of regulation on investment. And we had a review of our wholesale services regime, the essential services proceeding a few years ago. And as a result of that, there are a number of categories of services that are being phased out for mandated access. And the regulator is also looking right now at another proceeding, looking at the impact of wholesale access regulation on investment and competition and consumers, and a current proceeding that's underway right now.
Thank you for your question, Jerry. The Digital Britain reviewed Ofcom's responsibilities as a regulator, and traditionally its role has been on protecting consumer interests and ensuring competition. It's now got an additional responsibility of ensuring that nothing undermines investment, and Ofcom has to do a report every 3 years on the status of those. So that's sort of how it's being addressed in the UK. They recognise that you've got to get a balance between the two. On investment, I think investment's been quite strong in the UK in the communications sector. Over the last 5 years, we've seen investment in the communications infrastructure of 34 billion pounds, so roughly $55 billion, give or take. And that equates about 24% of the total investment in the entire UK's infrastructure. So I think that's quite significant. And I think when you see private companies like Virgin and BT rolling out that super-fast broadband, I'm seeing it hitting 50% of homes with speeds of 50 megabits per second this year, sort of demonstrates that the companies don't feel any disincentive to invest. So it's got to get that balance right, but I think we've got the positive relationship in the UK. And so much so that when we're looking at the rollout of super-fast broadband over the next decade, those looking at Digital Britain assess that they should be able to get the majority of that funded through the private sector, and it's only the final third of the country where it's not commercially viable. The government may need to be providing a subsidy to make up the difference between deployment in those difficult-to-reach areas versus the sort of commercially economic ones. So it's sort of minimum investment required from the government. I'm not going to get drawn on Title I versus Title II. I think that's an issue for the FCC and its stakeholders to agree, not for me.
Okay. I have interesting stories. Before back to 20 years, United States want Korea to open our telecom markets. At that time, we have only just one market, telecommunication services. We cannot open telecommunication service like foreign investments. So I was involved how to classify telecom services. And we benchmarked Europe and United States and Canada, many countries. And a lawyer from FCC explained very detail about how United States classify telecommunication services. I remind that it's a Title I and Title II, and usually basic service and enhanced or information services. So in the 1990s, we made a draft to classify three parts: the facility-based services, and we separate the mobile service market. So telecom facility services and mobile service and enhanced service. We got idea from you, and later we merged facility-based services and evaluated enhanced services. And we classified internet services as enhanced services. And we have very light regulation until now. It is very easy to provide. It's just a registration or simple procedures. Now, I've seen that FCC is trying to reclassify your internet service as the telecommunication services. Anyway, by that classification, now in Korea we have a light regulation about broadband and internet.
I find most discussions about the impact of regulation on investment to be actually quite amusing. I spent 8 years talking with investors on this subject, and it's really, really multifactorial, and there's not one thing that does it. I'm reminded in the first round of filings Verizon sent us this marvelous chart entitled, I believe, Deregulation Causes an Increase in Capital Expenditures. And it pointed out that between 2003 and 2007, Verizon CapEx had risen 40%. But unfortunately for them, they also included the years 1996 to 2000, in which CapEx had increased 110%. And I don't think Verizon was trying to make the point that the 96 Act was a deregulatory act. Maybe they were, I don't know. But my point is, my point other than to make fun of them for, if you're going to cherry pick data, don't give us don't give us the data that completely disproves your point. That to say that regulation causes disinvestment or causes investment is about like saying the publication of the broadband plan caused the euro to go down relative to the dollar. I mean, you could chart it out, and it is true that since March 16th, the value of the euro has gone down tremendously, as a matter of fact. But I don't think anyone in this room would say that that was the cause of the euro going down. So a lot of these studies, violate the rule of correlation and implies causation. But you have to be, it is complicated, it is difficult. The reason why investment went up so great in the last half of the last decade was because there was this incredible opportunity that people were trying to gather. There also was a competitive element that really drove a huge amount of investment too. So, there's a lot of different variables. I will say absolutely that the single most important input that the government controls for purposes of investment is spectrum. And if we don't get serious about it and its impact, we're going to suffer a lot more than on these other things. And as to Title I and Title II, well, there are so many things to say, but I'll just say that as I hear both sides discuss the choice, it reminds me of Woody Allen's comment that mankind is at a crossroads. One path leads to utter hopelessness and despair. The second path to complete annihilation. Let us hope we have the wisdom to choose wisely. I don't see it in the same way. And I think that ultimately, the Title I and Title II debate, I separate policy from litigation strategy. And Title I and Title II is fundamentally about a litigation strategy. And the important thing is, how do we take advantage of broadband to improve healthcare in this country, to provide better public safety, to provide education. The Title I and II debate doesn't really go to those things, and I hope that we get to those things because that's really where the joy is, that's where the sunny upside is, and that's where the debate, in my opinion, ought to be.
I think we've got time for one more, since I'm standing here.
Hi, Alyssa Clemson with IBEC. My question, I guess, is we've all talked about what the coverage rates are. In this country, I know the FCC claims about 95%, and you all have mentioned, I think, 98, 92. How did you get to those numbers? Did you do advertised speeds? Did you survey customers? Did you go off of the actual provider's information? How did you get to your percentages of covered homes?
When we estimating in Korean penetration rate or adoption rate, usually we get information from internet service providers. They exactly know how many customers they have. And about the speed, actually many times it was advertised service right.
Similarly, in Canada, the regulator, the CRTC, collects information from the service providers, and it is based on the advertised speed.
Yeah, pretty much the same for the UK, although Digital Britain was a public consultation, so the public and those who perhaps may have disagreed with what some of the ISPs were saying will have the opportunity to make that known. But it's largely within the hands of Ofcom.
Well, the German Ministry of Economics has a infrastructure atlas, which is close to a broadband map, and this is based on actual services. And the figure for Germany for the end of 2010 is to be claimed 99.9%, 1 megabit.
I just refer you to the 130-plus page paper on the broadband availability gap that had the model for what we did. And just to be clear, the 95 figure is not a figure that says 95% have broadband as defined by 4 down, 1 up today. It's just that they're living within, they're living in proximity to networks capable of providing. So the number's been misused a little bit, but fundamentally that was what we thought was the important thing. So, but it's obviously much more detailed.
Drew tells me we can get one more question in. Somebody wants to? You seem very eager.
My name is Prudence Parks, and I'm with the Utilities Telecom Council. And one of the other issues that was the focus of the National Broadband Plan is the support of the adoption, implementation of smart grid. I think that all of us can agree that the digital economy, as well as much of the essential way of life here in the United States, is reliant upon reliable electrical energy. We were very pleased when we saw in Canada that they had actually allocated a portion of spectrum for smart grid because there is a lack of spectrum available dedicated to the electric industry for their essential services. I think that's a recognition in Canada that it's a nascent industry and that it needs to be fostered in order to be able to increase the efficiency of the grid. We were not as pleased with the National Broadband Plan.
We were aware of this.
Yes, there is a question. Because of the North American, it is a North American grid, how did Canada come to a different conclusion that smart grid needed spectrum and yet the United States did not, or the National Broadband Plan did not recognize that need?
I'm tempted to snarkily answer, I assume it's because in Canada the lobbyists are better. I didn't mean that at all. I don't know I'll let Canada speak for Canada. I'll just say we hotly debated this issue, and you're welcome to continue the debate. We talked to a number of smart grid folks, VCs, private equity guys, people who are investing in it and making it real. And when you look at the bandwidth characteristics that you need, it's not a lot of bandwidth. And the current mobile markets, the current spectrum capacity can take it. That's actually not the problem. What we saw as the problem was really in the area of personal data. Reasonable minds can differ. I know you disagree because we read your stuff. But I will say that if you look at the people investing in it, they agreed with us. Obviously, everybody in the world, the first thing that they come to, and when they come to the FCC, is they say, give us spectrum for free. Now, that's actually not, we kind of had the attitude, you got to prove it. I will tell you, from our perspective, again, reasonable minds can differ. We don't think you made the case for a separate network. We don't think you made a case for separate spectrum. That did not seem to us to be the barrier to creating it. But we debated it long and hard, and the debate, I'm sure, continues. But I do appreciate the question.
Any last words on that, Ms. Miller?
I don't really know the dynamics of the different decision-making here, so just to say that we're looking upon it as a good opportunity to see, as a test bed, and to see what kind of innovative applications occur.
Well, before we thank our great panel and our great moderator, I have a few very brief announcements. This excellent program will be available online for all of you and for everyone else, including those who had to leave early. So please let them know that you'll be able to see it by the end of the week on broadbandbreakfast.com. As you may have noted by looking at the back side of the program, we've got a busy summer planned. We have a number of programs coming up. Obviously, challenges to rural broadband adoption will be our next Broadband Breakfast Club on June 15th. But please note, we've also launched the Intellectual Property Breakfast Club, and the next episode of that will be on June 8th about new retransmission consent battles and video licensing. And that event, the Intellectual Property Breakfast Club, will be free, so we certainly welcome all of you to share the word with your colleagues interested in intellectual property. And I also want to say that we do really encourage and welcome your feedback, not only on these programs and planned programs, but on our website. We strive to publish timely news and informed expert opinion on broadband and intellectual property. I'd like to introduce Sylvia Syracuse. If you could please stand up. So Sylvia is our Director of Marketing and Events. So please feel free to give your card to her, offer any suggestions or thoughts to Sylvia so that she can incorporate that into our programs here. And again, before we thank our panel and our speaker and our moderator, as well as each of you for coming, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our sponsors, the International Broadband Electric Communications, Inc., the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, the Benton Foundation, and the Telecommunications Industry Association. So please join me in thanking all of the people who have participated in our program.